Hello, my name is Matt Foy, and I'm going to tell the story of the Harrison River Chinook, the Stashkamuk, which is a Halkomelem word, Coast Salish word for the lower mainland of southern British Columbia. And this is going to be a story of where they spawn, where they rear as small juveniles in fresh water, and their journey in the big blue sea. I hope you enjoy this story. So this is just a little closer look at the spawning grounds of the Harrison River Chinook salmon. The little yellow star is Harrison Lake. You'll see a community just immediately below that star. That's the Harrison Hot Springs community. Harrison Lake is a really large, 70 kilometers or longer lake that discharges through a relatively short river, the Harrison River. So the water quality is very high, the flows are quite high, it's a very large watershed. If you see the two little red lines, that's the section of the river that these Harrison River Chinook spawn in. It's relatively short, 4,000 meters in length. But that 4,000 meters supports what is the largest spawning population of Chinook salmon in the Fraser River watershed and one of the largest and most numerous Chinook populations in the world. It'll have somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 spawners in an average year spawning in this section of river. So that's just a heck of a lot of Chinook. And there's a number of reasons why this population is so large. And we'll talk in some detail about why this is such a unique area for Chinook salmon and why this population does so well. Okay, so let's look at why so many Chinook spawn there. And it begins with the very large Harrison Lake, which means that the water flowing out of the lake is always really clean, even during the worst floods of fall. It's a huge lake with many, many tributaries that in a heavy fall rain and flood carry a lot of silt and sand, but that silt and sand is deposited in this huge lake, which settles out, and when the flows leave the lake, they're virtually always clean. So what does that mean? That incubating salmon eggs downstream from Harrison Lake will thrive with this clean water, that doesn't have a lot of silt and dirt that would plug up the gravel and cutting off the flow of oxygen to these eggs. It creates a really high quality incubation environment for eggs. And the Harrison River water is really clean. So the nearby Chehalis River on this slide, the blue arrows denote the flow of the Harrison River, but the red arrows denote the Chehalis River, various river mouths over time as this river is moved back and forth across its floodplain. Now the Chehalis River, this comes out of the mountainous area, carries a lot of gravel. So over time, it has effectively deposited gravel all along this 4-kilometer reach. Really good spawning gravel. But once it's in the Harrison River, it doesn't move. It effectively stays in place. It isn't scoured out in floods because Harrison Lake moderates those floods like a big battery. It stores the flood water and releases it slowly. So the gravels that are deposited over time by the Chehalis over centuries, the only thing that really moves it downstream is spawning salmon, not necessary flooding. So this is important. If you're a salmon egg and you're deposited in clean gravel that doesn't move, that has clean water flowing over, you get very high survival to fry emergence. So another point to consider, the Harrison River Chinook spawning section, the section of the river they use, is 4,000 meters long approximately. And this is a big river, averaging probably 300 meters wide or wider in some places. And if you do the math, that gives you 1,200,000 square meters of clean, stable, perfect spawning gravel. So thinking about this, a large Chinook nest or red would require about 5 square meters of spawning gravel in the area. So if you do the math again, that 1.2 million square meters would support about 240,000 reds, Chinook salmon reds. So one male, one female, 480,000 spawners. Now remember I said there's 1 to 200,000, suggesting there is more gravel today than spawners to use it. It's a huge area of gravel. Although it's a huge run, they still have not hit the limit of their spawning capacity of that reach. So what we know from our studies that those spawners produce in many years around 30 million or so Chinook fry. These are the little guys that come out of the gravel. And basically that's a lot of mouths to feed. And the question is, where do they feed? Now, if you look to the slide that I've put up, just as an aside, to indicate how stable the gravel is I pose a question, what is a salmon spawning dune? And then you'll see the little red lines, well, you're looking at some right now. If you look, it looks like the ripples you see on the sand at White Rock Beach. But they're ripples of gravel, and they might be 5 meters high from the deepest to the shallowest. They might be 15 meters wide at their crest, and they might be 150 meters long. There's a series of ridges of gravel, and they're not formed by flowing water. They're formed by generation after generation of salmon spawning and lining up beside each other, and over time they create these large dunes. And because the river is so stable, these dunes are not flattened and washed away each fall. Now you see this only at the outlet of really big lakes with stable outlets, typically associated with Chinook salmon, sometimes with sockeye salmon, but Chinook salmon in particular because of their size and the size of their reds. Harrison River has beautiful dune formations that have been created by generations of salmon over hundreds or thousands of years, and it's a thing of beauty, which makes the Harrison such a special place in our area. So where do those 30 million little fry go to when they leave the Harrison River spawning grounds? So the little yellow star gives an approximation where those spawning grounds are located. And the green arrows just give a sense of where the Chinook fry are migrating to. There's about 150 kilometers or more of main stem habitat, side channel habitat, tributary habitat that these Chinook fry will move down and then look for rearing habitats. They're looking for the slow edges, the slow back sloughs, the bottom ends of tributaries, and they'll poke their noses anywhere that they can get into, usually to the head of tide. Wherever the tide goes, that's where you'll find Chinook fry from the Harrison River in the spring. So they rear in these habitats, up to 8 weeks, and somewhere around early May as the temperatures rise, temperatures getting a little warm for their liking, they get to about 70 millimeters. They've grown from 40 millimeters to 70 millimeters, and they're preparing for their life in the ocean and begin their migration down to the Strait of Georgia around that time. So how can we help them? Well, we can look at all those various areas and look for barriers that might be improved so they can get past them into habitats they want to use, or perhaps habitats that can be enhanced for their use or made better, possibly ones that have been impacted from past land development. We can do some techniques that'll just make them friendlier for little Harrison River Chinook fry for the 8-week rearing period. So let's go on and talk a little bit about these examples on the Stave River, the Salmon River, and on the Coquitlam River. So we know from our scientific studies of the lower Fraser that these Harrison River Chinook fry often seek out the smallest channels, often that are affected by daily tides. And these tides can reach as far upstream as the Mission Bridge and the Fraser, or even slightly higher. And these little fish are most happy in little habitats where big fish won't go and eat them. So with this in mind, if more early spring habitat, that's that February to May period, was available in the lower Fraser River floodplain, then it's likely that more Chinook would return to use all that wonderful gravel beds in the Harrison River. Simple. When you look at the numbers, it is likely the rearing habitat in this case, unlike the upper pit example, that is limiting the size of the Harrison River Chinook population. So if you remember the headline that started this conversation, that described overcoming the 1,000 barriers that deny salmon access to the historic habitat, the vast majority of these barriers occur along the tributaries of the lower Fraser River and are largely related to flood control infrastructure. The places that these flood structures protect are places that Harrison River Chinook once lived a century ago. So this is one of the examples of salmon habitat restoration done on the lower Fraser, directed at these Harrison River fry. It's on the lower section of the Stave River, and it's within the tidal range. The tidal range is about 1.5 meters in this spot between high and low tide. So in the lower Stave River, there's a series of old agricultural fields that have been restored to recreate the small tidal channels that existed before they were filled and farmed. Now, it is these small tidally affected channels that are highly sought out by young Harrison River Chinook fry to rear in for a couple months each spring prior to their ocean entry. And the lower Stave is one such area that we've done this type of work. So this is an aerial view of a tidal channel restoration project on the lower Stave River that was led by the Fraser Valley Watersheds Coalition in partnerships with Kwantlen First Nation, DFO Salmon Enhancement Program, and BC Hydro's Fish and Wildlife Compensation Program. Again, it's a large project that's tidally affected, so the Harrison River Chinook fry will come up with the tide. The channels will fill, they'll feed all along the margins, and then when the tide goes out, a portion will stay and a portion will go back into the main stem, Stave River. There's a lot of movement of water, a lot of movement of food items, and this is exactly the habitats, the critical habitats that Harrison River Chinook fry are looking for, so they can grow to that critical 70 millimeter size before they head down to the Strait of Georgia. The last picture of this series, I'll just give you a shot of one of the channels just to give you a sense of scale. It's actually a very large project, and it was delivered, I think, in 2018. I think they took 2 seasons of work to complete the entire complex. So this is just the lower end of one of these constructed tidal channels on the Stave River. You can see it's quite large. If you notice, the banks are relatively low slope, and they will vegetate over with natural grasses. And in the higher areas, particularly where the spoil has been placed, a series of native shrubs are being planted. Again, these tidal channels, tides come in twice a day, fill them up, juvenile fish move into them, and as the tides recede, most of the little guys will still stay in the channel. Some may move back into the Stave River, but a very dynamic area where a lot of food items are being moved by these tidal flows of water, and a very productive area. And these are the key critical habitats for Harrison River Chinook, particularly in that early phase from about March 1st till the onset of the Fraser freshet sometime in May. So this is a sort of a construction action shot of how these tidal channels are built. This is a channel very similar in form to what we were looking at on the lower Stave River, but this one is on the lower Coquitlam River in an area we call the sheep paddocks. The lands that this channel was built on are now part of the Metro Vancouver Colony Farm Parks, and these fields are no longer going to be used for agriculture, so they're being reclaimed for fish and wildlife. Just a few features to notice. The channel meanders, has a natural meander pattern. It has both steep banks, and then closer to the water's edge you'll see a much shallower bank, and then another steep bank, and then the materials in the background where the machine are being shaped into a mound. What this allows is a very diverse area for planting different groups of plants. So the lowest areas might be sedges and other wetland, tidal wetland type plants. Then a little higher, some shrubs where they're just above where they're planting now. And then the highest points might be trees that don't want to be wet at every high tide. So again, the attempt is to make it good for fish, but also make it good for all sorts of different types of wildlife. This is pretty common in these tidal channel areas. They're very high use by multiple species of fish and wildlife. So we do everything we can to make it the most diverse habitat possible. So this is just another picture of the project we just looked at during construction. A season or two has passed, and if you know, living in Scouch-Demouk, it rains here and it's mild, so you give a plant half a chance, it grows pretty quickly here. So within a season or two, the disturbed areas are fully revegetated. And that's actually why you should get your shrubs and your trees in, because the grasses, things like reed canary grass, will recover very, very quickly. So you want to push a few more plants in there to maximize diversity as quickly as you can. And of course, all this vegetation generates insects, and all those insects feed these little fish that we're trying to help. So these tidal channels are not just important to Harrison River Chinook, and they are important to Harrison River Chinook, but every tide will bring in probably 25 or more different species potentially into these tidal channels. Some of the more common ones are a stickleback, both resident and migratory forms, but also high-value species like coho salmon would often spend the winter in these tidal channels, and species like rainbow, which are steelhead, probably will spend a portion of time foraging in there, maybe in the spring before they smolt up. And cutthroat trout may spend a portion of their year in these channels feeding on the rich insect life, and some of them may be large, almost adult size, and some may be just pre-smolts. So a real diversity in these tidal channels. When you do sampling, you look for your target fish, Harrison River Chinook, but you find a wealth of others, which makes it really encouraging when you do this types of work in the lower Fraser tidal reach. So the study that got into the headline, talking about 85% of historic rearing habitats denied to salmon, speak directly to Harrison Chinook fry being denied access to their rearing habitats on the lower Fraser River floodplain. So most of these lost areas are protected from flooding by the Fraser River by extensive dike systems and pump stations and culverts. So we're looking at the flood pump station at the mouth of the Salmon River. On the right is the Fraser River. On the other side of the station is the Salmon River. The Salmon River has to flow through gates under this structure. And when the river's in flood, when the Fraser River's in flood, they actually pump the Salmon River over. At that point, the little fish has no chance of getting into the Salmon River. So we'll be talking about these types of structures. So these stations were designed, many of them were placed in after the Great Flood of 1948, which flooded large parts of the Fraser Valley. They're meant to keep us dry and safe when the Fraser River goes into its springtime floods in May. But they stop the tides from going into these floodplain channels and are tough barriers for the Harrison River Chinook fry to overcome. So if we could restore young salmon access and tidal flows past these barriers, then the Harrison River Chinook fry would do the rest. It's not easy, but it's also not impossible. So I showed you the pump station at the mouth of the Salmon River because it is an example of a structure that was modified to make it more friendly for young salmon to come out of the Fraser River into the lower end of the Salmon River. So in 1999, the flood pump at that station was reconstructed and a small fish passage was placed through this huge structure controlled by an automatic gate. So if the water got too high in the Fraser River, so it might flood homes inland of the flood structure, the gate shut itself automatically. But if the water was not too high, the gate decided it was safe to remain open. Simple. This gate structure, which was not simple to get installed, made all the difference for the Harrison River Chinook fry use of the lower Salmon River in the spring. So the lower Salmon River is really high quality habitat for Harrison River Chinook fry, and they get access and they go upstream about 7 kilometers. So that's a lot of habitat for a relatively simple structure. And there's many, many, many of these large flood structures located all along the lower Fraser River at the mouths of many small streams, such as the Salmon River here in Fort Langley. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about the story of how these little fish use the lower Salmon River, I wrote a story for the operators of the pump station, for the residents in the Salmon River watershed, and the general public, just to let people know these structures need to be operated well. They're there. These structures have an ability to work with the salmon, but we have to do our part, because a couple of years ago, people that were operating the pump station forgot what the little gate was for. It was put in 1999, and people move on. People perhaps don't read certain guidelines that are back in 20 years old. So this little story is a gentle reminder, hey folks, we can do this, we can have our flood structure, but we can also let the little fish go where they want to, which will turn into big fish and feed the killer whales, they'll feed us, and they'll make us all proud when they return back to the Harrison River. I'd recommend you have a look at this story. I've given you the link. So as we've discussed, Harrison River fry, when they emerge from the gravel beds in the Harrison River, migrate down the Fraser and up virtually every slow water habitat available to them that's within the reach of the tides in the lower Fraser River, including in the Salmon River, the Stave River, the Coquitlam River, and the bottom ends of all the various tributaries of the lower Fraser. But a significant portion migrate quickly down to the estuary where the saltwater and the freshwater mixes. And in the estuary is a series of small channels, and these are the core habitats for the Harrison Chinook fry. They're relatively small fry. They want relatively small habitats to begin their rearing phase, and they'll be in the estuary for many months. Some of them sometimes for a few days, a few weeks, but some for months. They can enter the estuary in as early as perhaps late February, early March, and will stay in the estuary well into the early parts of the summer. This is a recent and quite illuminating research paper on Chinook salmon juvenile use of the Fraser River, but you'll notice the dominance of the Chinook fry from the Harrison River in the Fraser estuary. Well worth the read. Here's the link. So we've talked a lot about Harrison River Chinook fry rearing in the freshwater environments of the lower Fraser. And before we dive into the next part of our Harrison River Chinook story regarding the Big Blue Sea, a little side trip. So studies have shown that it appears that when the now fattened up Chinook fry head out to the ocean from the Salmon River, from the Coquitlam River tidal channels, from the tidal channels on the Stave, They ride along with the silty waters of the Fraser River plume and live for a while on the beaches and nearshore marine habitats throughout the southern Strait of Georgia. Effectively, wherever the Fraser water goes, these guys follow. So roughly from the southern half of Howe Sound in the north to the San Juan Islands in the south, our Harrison River, which are often noted as Lower Fraser Fall Chinook as a conservation unit, hang out in these shallow, rich feeding areas for a month or two or more before finally heading out to the setting sun out west and the big blue sea. As always, it's complicated. So here's a little picture of what that Fraser River plume might look like. The Fraser River discharges into the Strait of Georgia through the north arm, the middle arm, and the south arm. And depending on the tidal strength, that plume, when an incoming tide pushes the water north, will enter Howe Sound, the lower half of Howe Sound. And when the outgoing tides pull the plume to the south, it'll go as far down and even farther as the beaches of San Juan Islands. So the two studies I'm going to show you to give you a sense of where these Harrison River Chinook fry go in the nearshore environment are the yellow star in the north and the yellow star in the south. So this is from a Howe Sound Juvenile Chinook study report in 2012. You'll notice the green circles indicate Harrison River Chinook fry captures. The largest captures were in the beginning of May, about the time we see them leaving the Fraser River sloughs and channels as the water temperatures rise. And by toward June, it looks like their numbers are much less in Howe Sound as other populations of Chinook move into the beaches there. Again, it's a complex movement of populations that seem to use habitats at different times and places. Again, it appears to be complicated. So this was another study looking at juvenile Chinook salmon use of nearshore areas off the San Juan Islands. So the lower Fraser summer fall, which is our Harrison River Chinook fry, are the black portions of these circles. So you can see their numbers begin rising in that area mid-April through early June and dominate the near shore by mid-June. They're still there in some numbers mid-July, and their numbers are dropping rapidly in August. So again, it appears that our Harrison River Chinook fry, while they move out of freshwater, perhaps beginning in May through June, it looks like they are in fact rearing in the Strait of Georgia in the near shore for a significant period of time before they head out into the big blue sea. We have a lot to learn, and these are complicated fish, and from a salmon habitat restoration, these sorts of studies suggest the health of beaches and nearshore areas may be areas well worth spending some effort in the future. So, okay, when Harrison Chinook enter the ocean, there's been a number of studies from our tagging of little fish in freshwater. We put things like coated wire tags. And when a fisherman captures that fish, they can collect that tags and find out where they came from. That's one hint on where Harrison Chinook live in the ocean. The second tool that has been used is the new genetic tool, where again, if a fish is captured in the ocean, it can take a little bit of tissue, and from that tissue can identify what particular watershed that fish was from. But again, it relates to catching those fish. So you have this large ocean. There's only fisheries in certain places. There's only research vessels in certain places. It is largely a mystery where the Harrison River Chinook go when they enter the ocean. What we do know from various fishery samples that the yellow line shown on the slide roughly shows where Harrison Chinook have been found. Most of them seemed to stage off western Vancouver Island as they grow. Some go down into the US, Washington, perhaps northern Oregon. A few go as far north, perhaps as far north as the Aleutians or south central Alaska. A very large area. We think they largely stay on the continental shelf, but really, who knows? Because we don't sample far offshore very much. So this is the major part of their life cycle. And this is the message of this piece of the story. So after all our hard work, what will come back as adults, the fish we want to come back for our fisheries, to feed our whales, to see on the spawning grounds, will reflect two things. How many smolts went to sea? As we've discussed, that we can affect from our efforts. But how many survived at sea, we will have little ability to affect. And that is a fact we will have to live with. We will have good years and we will have bad years, largely driven by ocean conditions. But there are some truths we have to understand. If no smolts go to sea, no adults will return. We won't get bad years. We will get years no salmon return. So our actions in freshwater do matter for the future of salmon here in Stashkamuk. So for the Harrison River Chinook, perhaps we'll see a year of a fantastic run when the ocean is friendly and all our hard work in freshwater has put a record numbers of smolts into that ocean. And that's what keeps us going. But we will also have years when the ocean is not friendly to salmon. And just surviving will be a good thing. So the Harrison River run doesn't disappear and will live to fight again, to fight another day. And that's what we do in salmon habitat restoration. We give them a half a chance to fight another day. And I just want to leave this story and point out on the slide there's a report that I've highlighted. You can click, go to the link. It's a new study that talks about where Harrison River Chinook fry and other Chinook fry living in the Fraser River Estuary. It's a really good study, a really good group of people doing new work and using the new genetic tools to figure out who's in the estuary when. It's well worth your time to read it. So this headline has been in the news lately. And it's a story that's asked the question, could removing over 1,000 barriers here in the lower mainland bring them back, bring the salmon back? So my thought would be, if we work together to fix fish passage past all the flood barriers along the lower Fraser, one by one, which is hard and slow work, my answer is absolutely for at least the Chinook of the Harrison River. So have a look at this YouTube video. It's been by a group talking about flood barriers along the Fraser River, and then think about how their effort would affect the population we're talking about today, the Harrison River Chinook. So really this is what salmon habitat restoration is all about. It's just picking your fights, being smart, being patient, fighting hard, and hopefully you can sit back and watch 500,000 Harrison River, big Chinook, splash and dig, and fill the spawning beds, and be happy each fall in that beautiful place. Simple. But just like all things in nature, it's not simple. There is probably going to be more to this story over the next decades, and that, my friends, will almost certainly take place in the big and beautiful and mysterious Big Blue Sea. So this is just a list of references that were presented throughout this story about the Harrison River Chinook. They're live in the PowerPoint presentation, but if you're looking at the YouTube version, go to the description of the video at the front end, and hopefully all these links will be there, and hopefully they'll be live, and you'll be able to read these various pieces of information that hopefully will make it more understandable and the story more interesting.